Hello, welcome back. Today I will attempt something courageous, rather crazy. I will try to walk you through Middle East history in roughly probably 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So it's a really ridiculous attempt to summarize hundreds and thousands of years of history in one of the most important regions in the world. So please excuse anything that I've left out, but it's also important that we really keep it at the major happenings, because otherwise we just could learn for the rest of our lives on Middle East history. So really take this as a spark of maybe interest. I would be excited if that would happen with you, that you would read a little further. But the Middle East is important, not only to obviously the region in of itself, but also for us. So for example, that we eat with forks or knives, or that we have a fashion industry, or singing songwriter. I mean, basically Bob Dylan getting the Nobel Prize pretty much has to do with the expansion of the Islamic world into the Western realm very early on. So, or at least partly that can be credited to Arab empires expanding to Europe. So I will go not that far back, but I really want to encourage you to do that if you're obviously interested. I will mainly focus on modern history. And we'll reference back every now and then to like the older days. It is a very diverse history. Before I get started, just keep in mind again, and I think throughout the course you will learn that, and I hope you will take that away, is that we have here a region that artificially created and has very separate cultures that are far more diverse than Europe or the US in terms of culture, politics, and economics. So I've subdivided this lecture into mainly three parts. First, the nuts, the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the European imperialism that shaped the Middle East, mainly towards World War I and afterwards. And then the bolts mainly look at the economic development in the countries in the Middle East after they gained independence from European powers. And then I will look shortly or briefly at the Arab Spring. I think it's a very good connection here if we look at a historical perspective. But I will pick the Arab Spring and the democratic uprisings in the regions up again later in our third week of the class. So let me get started with the Ottoman Empire. And again, even that can just have an entire class. But one of the major takeaways, I think, from the Ottoman Empire, and here I show you a picture or the map of how far it really went. It really encompassed everything that we define today at the modern Middle East. So the Ottoman Empire rose towards its wide range of influence for more than 600 years, and then gradually declines until 1922, and this decline really explains much of the complex situation in the Middle East today. So for nearly 600 years it constituted the last era of world history when the Middle East was politically, economically, and militarily more powerful than the West. The West referring here as Europe and Russia. Its decline was gradual and went hand in hand actually with European states becoming more powerful and influential in the region. So really simply put, the reason for the decline was because the European states become simply better at warfare and trading, partly copying what the Ottoman Empire was doing, but obviously also innovating. But on the other hand, also internally, the Ottomans were unable to keep up with those developments, and with those developments in Europe, we're not able to learn or relearn what the Europeans were doing, and the gap between Europe and the Middle East just became simply too big. On the other hand, also because the reforms that were necessary within the Ottoman Empire faced too much internal resistance. So it's pretty much only one area, as you can see here on the map, that has not been affected or was not part of the Ottoman or fell under Ottoman rule, never really fell under Ottoman rule, and that's Persia. So today is Iran. It's important to keep in mind also for later on. So while the Ottomans were Sunni Muslims, the Persians were Shiites, and I'm not going too much into the difference between Shiites and Sunnis. You can look that up on your own. and I will post a video as well to kind of illustrate that. I also feel like partly the sectarian differences in the Middle East are getting a little bit overemphasized. However, it's important that you know the difference. But I think for now it's important to keep in mind that Iran is really a special case in the Middle East. But ultimately, it was really the threat of Western intervention, right, mainly by Britain and Russia, as well as the rise of Turkish nationalism after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that really sparked the movement of Arab nationalism. So having separate states and separate independence on their own. So after the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922, it was pretty much only Turkey that managed to retain independence. Again, Persia, Iran is separate, but from all of the old Ottoman Empire, it is kind of interesting that only really Turkey remained independent. And that is interesting because those Arabs who were allied with the winners of World War I that actually not achieve their political goals after 1918, whereas Turkey was actually, or the Ottoman Empire was actually supported Germany in the war, and were subsequently defeated, managed to retain their independence once the war was over. And the readings really nicely explain that. But also that shows again what wide variety of historical contexts we have in the Middle East. So this map kind of shows you nicely that at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and then actually what happened in 1922 after World War I, which different forces were most influential. We have here mainly French, of course the British, especially if you dive into the history of the creation of the State of Israel and the dispute with the Palestinians. Britain becomes very important here, but also the French and then the Italians. Moreover, so here I show you a map about like which countries were on what influence. I didn't mention all of the countries, but I think it kind of shows you nicely. So the blue is France, Italy is green, and the UK is orange. Those pink with the pink dots are actually those that gained independence on their own. They were never under European power influence. So let's dive a little bit into the interests of European powers, and I think it kind of subsequently also explains why it is so difficult, and the influence of the U.S. in that region so vital, because most of European forces or powers kind of burned their fingers in the Middle East already. So the interests of the Europeans were manifolded. Some territories that they occupied were already colonies, for example Libya, Morocco, Algeria, before the World War I, and then they just basically continue to be exploited. There's a very good table, I think, in the Penna Angers reading that I would like to refer you to, and look at it. Really nicely shows where the kind of different European powers were involved. But most recent relations that really came about after World War I, as for example with the Arabian Peninsula, took form of treaty relationships and were less exploratory, but also obviously very much driven by their own national economic and security interests. Security interests at the time were not that much of an issue, much more today than they were at the time. So France and Britain drew the lines, for example, of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine most prominently, and selected, for example, the kings in Iraq and Jordan. In Morocco, France reformed the administrative system that is still in place until today, I mean, among other things. And then, of course, the very well-known example of Algeria, where it uprooted tribes, confiscated land, and resettled 150,000 Europeans, and annexed basically an entire country until it was part of, until the point that it was really part of France in and of itself. Bloody civil war followed, and Algeria gained independence in 1962. The emergence of Israel, and I was debating that back and forth, I will continue put it into this lecture, and I really think the emergence of Israel is a major happening in the Middle East history, and left a lasting imprint of the politics. and I won't be talking about it too much. It's really much covered in the readings. I think that is important, and I also kind of refer to the person who has actually Palestine and Israel to work on the historical context here. However, it is important to keep in mind that was really the emergence of Israel is quite decisive when it comes to the history of the modern Middle East, and also reflects much of what I just said about the influence of the UK and France and the drawing of artificial boundaries. So to summarize, the Ottoman Empire really much gave way for European engagement in the Middle East, but also already started the differential treatment of different countries that until pretty much continue until today. Under European imperialism, also that was very much differentiated. We did see a rise of Arab nationalism with the increased influence of European powers in the Middle East, and we also see that the emergence of Israel kind of comes side by side with the increased influence of European powers, and hence makes the whole creation of the State of Israel even more complicated until today. So the bolts that kind of create the economic development in post-independence Middle East are threefold. The first are in the 60s and 70s, where most all of Middle East countries actually regained independence from their European power, and the main economic policy during that time was import substitution and state-led industrialization. So we saw high growth rates, improved quality of life, child mortality went down quite significantly, but also poverty rates declined significantly more than in any other regions in the global South during this time. In the 1980s and 1990s was really a period of adjustment. So after this fairly good start, after independence from European powers, the MENA fairly high debts that they accumulated during the 1960s and 1970s were addressed with reduced public spending and a move towards market economy. So that partly to do with the influence of the IMF, for example, but also the general sense that the Washington Consensus is the right way forward for economies around the world. So the Washington Consensus laid out that trade liberalization, public enterprise privatization, and the opening of the financial sector and the national currency that needed to be sharply devalued to encourage export would actually be the right recipe for any economy to grow. Instead, though, this first resulted into very slow growth and even recession. And some call these decades like lost decades for the Middle East, because instead of achieving political economic growth, did quite the difference. And the political cost to actually address these or to balance out the effects on the social system by these reforms were fairly high and not really addressed. And so you can see that the recent growth in the 2000 and 2010 was really a kind of a mix between these two eras, the post-independence and then the adjustment era, because the idea by the political regimes was really to structurally adjust and maintain macro stability. It sounds a little bit technical, but mainly meant that there was the focus on private sector-driven economies, but with a little bit more public spending or subsidies in that sense, but not as much as we've seen in the post-independence era. So it's kind of balanced out basically what the Washington Consensus created in most of these countries. But what we see here, and that puzzles a lot of economists, interestingly, more than political scientists, is that economic underperformance pretty much remains, even though some countries really followed very straightforward the idea of market liberalization. And that is, I think, a great example of how important is to be a political scientist, because you have to put into the political factor in any economic reform process, because it is easy to do economic reforms first. and then tackle political reforms later. Political reforms often are very costly, take a longer time, and maybe you're never done. And that I think we can see in a lot of countries throughout the Middle East. But really it's important that economic and political reforms need to go hand in hand, because you have to have the political actors that actually implement the economic reforms. But also, you need the economic reforms to understand where the economy should be going. So when we look then at the Arab Spring, which is the most recent kind of political development in the Middle East, I would say, apart of course from the civil war in Syria, it is interesting to keep this economic development in mind. The Arab Spring is explained why it came about by various scientists, of course, but I think one of the most convincing arguments that are brought up is that we've seen a narrowing of authoritarian coalitions in the context of crony capitalism. So this rollback of the state and the decline of welfare regimes really much alienated formal sector worker and the middle class in the Middle East. So the explanation might be much more economic driven than maybe seen by most observers. So instead of truly opening up the market for liberalization, the regimes mainly used it to actually expand their elite networks into the economic realm and expanded their system of patronage rather than opening up this economic system for the middle class, which then resulted in much resentment in the long run. Because if you look at really the macroeconomic factors in the Middle East, there's really not much visible of an economic shock. So nothing really changed. We have had stable 4% GDP growth. The youth unemployment, which was fairly high, of course, across the region by 25%, was no new development. There was as we usually look for, like an economic shock, like what we've seen after the Soviet Union collapsed or during the collapse of the Soviet Union. We don't really see that in the Arab Spring. So one idea is here that it actually a lot depends on the perception of the public in terms of inequality. So maybe not the macroeconomic factors changed, but their perceived inequality changed, and their perceived inequality got worse, and that influenced the possibility of having democratic uprisings. So this last decade I talked before of the 1990s and 1980s, and this rollback of the state and the shift to market economies really contributed to these uprisings, because although for example, the parents of those youth, did fairly well after post-independence and were able to really gain good jobs and make fairly good money. We're really in this period where we've seen a lot of growth of wealth in the Middle East. Again, that obviously differs from country to country again, but the kids really were not able to do the same, or it was much harder, and they experienced this network of elites that they were maybe not able to get into it. There is, however, a very significant cross-regional variation of the Arab Spring, and the impact of the Arab Spring, and we will look into that later. But keep that in mind, of course, the Arab Spring did not have the same effect. We only have really one country that's truly democratic, that's Tunisia. Most of all, we have rather a winter of democracy than a spring. But in every country, I think, that had a protest going on, the middle class was a central actor of change. And we can also see an increased role of political Islam, and we'll talk about this later as well. So if you take for granted that the fear of Islamism strengthened authoritarian regimes and ruled for the last 50 years, I think what the Arab Spring showed is that the declining fear for Islamists weakened authoritarian rule. But we will talk about this at a later point again. Okay, so that was a kind of a whirlwind, and again, there's much more to say about Middle East history, but a couple of takeaways, I think, that are important here. So after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, only Turkey really remained independent. Iran being the big exception here. European powers draw artificial boundaries. They expanded their influence over the Middle East, North Africa, partly in colonies, partly with new treaties, but had significant interests here. The creation of Israel is a key factor of dispute also in the Middle East politics. So it's important to keep in mind, especially when we talk about regional integration, and we'll talk about this more in the upcoming lectures. And actually, this it's kind of puzzling still that we have a lagging economic performance despite modernization and reform in the Middle East. And one of the major explanations for this that have been floating around and pretty convincing until today is the fact that political reforms did not take place. Instead of reforming political networks, authoritarian rulers rather strengthened their elite networks into the economic realm, expanded it, and hence made it difficult for middle class actors to actually enter this new economic opportunity structure due to the opening of their markets. And then when we come to the Arab Spring, there's not really any economic shock that it can explain or that led to the Arab Spring. Rather, it was a lot about perceived economic inequality and a lot of other factors that contributed to those protests that in the long run, at least when we look at it today, did not necessarily lead to more democratization, but rather maybe even back to stronger authoritarian rule, especially if we look, of course, into Egypt. But we'll talk about that later on. So the next lecture is on political regimes. The quiz opens today, well, opened already, depending when you're watching this lecture, 6 a.m. Closes Friday, 10 p.m. And we'll pretty much cover all lectures and readings of this week. So make sure that you read carefully before and watch all the lectures before you open the quiz. Okay, thank you, and talk to you soon again.